Thanks for coming, guys. I really appreciate this. So today we're going to be talking about how religious theocracy, mainly from the Catholic Church, has influenced the current world of modern gastronomy and how this kind of affects Satanism, and as much as I can explain. So this is a lot of not only just Satanists, but people in the restaurant world can relate to over the years, and including anti-intellectualism and unscientific methods of management that have hurt people versus helping them. So we have here on the screen, this is Mythicus. So in ancient Greece, he's like the first celebrity chef, and he was around 5th century BC, and he was like, he pissed everybody off. Okay, so he was kicked out of like Sparta, and like Plato just had nothing nice to say about him, but he would like just go wherever and people would see him around, and basically the only thing he was known for doing was taking fish and cutting it into ribbons. So that was apparently like really cool back in the day. So that what's also interesting is that where he lived was Sicily, because back then Greece was pretty much all of Italy during that area. So that's also pretty interesting. He's also known probably for writing the first cookbook. And it's basic Greek cookbook. And yeah, the specialty in there is him just cutting up fish like ribbons. It was probably served with like lemon and olive oil and some kind of ceviche with salt. And that's probably what it was. And then, so this is Taillevent. So that was his name. He was around in the 14th century. He was a very important figure in French cuisine. And he's got like a real serious look to his face. And he was a cook to the court of France. So he worked for the hierarchy at the time. And he also worked for them and the kings during the first 100 Years' War. So he was basically a soldier, and he came back and he just decided to become a chef. So at the castle, he ended up becoming head chef to Philip VI, and he became the squire to Duke of Normandy, and yada, yada, yada. He basically was, so you had, he was like promoted by the hierarchy as like their chef. What's also interesting about him is that he supposedly wrote a book, and it was called La Vendière de Taillevent, and it's a recipe collection generally credited to just to himself, pretty much. And what's interesting about this is that this book was written 10 years before he was born. So he actually didn't really write this book, they don't think. Nobody knows who the author is. He just took his name and slapped it on it. There's another book in Satanism called The Might is Right, that the Church of Satan is also kind of comparatively used, where they plagiarized the book. But this book was pushed by the French government at the time. So nobody knew who the writer was, but they gave him all the credit. And it was basically a PR move on France's part, just to try and get more people to come to France. So the cookbook mostly records what royalty would eat, not the people, because the people would eat differently than them. It records heavily spiced dishes, spicy sauces, soups and stews, and instead of using flour as a thickening agent, he or whoever decided to do that put breadcrumbs in there as a thickening agent, which is also new to them. So what's also interesting in this cookbook is that roasting and broiling methods were first introduced to the world of culinary arts. Some people, as I said before, speculate that he wasn't even involved in this book, and it was instead Charles V who wrote it. This is also interesting. So there's that. And that's his book. It's pretty impressive, I gotta say. So this is Martino Rossi, and also known as the Maestro Martino. He was a 15th century culinary chef he was pretty much the Western world's first celebrity chef at this point. So he made his career in Italy, and he ended up becoming the chef of the Pope. And during his time of between 1460 and 1470, he was working all throughout Rome and working through the hierarchy of the Vatican. And what ended up happening was he was putting out these lavish banquets and like doing all these things just for the Vatican itself. And every single recipe that he was writing or that was served at the Vatican basically had to be approved by them. So they were vetting him very, very closely. They were making sure that his food was just like what they wanted, and it was promoted only within. So it's pretty interesting that he did everything through the Catholic Church's highest level. However, the people did not get to eat this food, so they did not necessarily approve of his food. So his reception outside of the walls of the Vatican was invalid. And it wasn't exactly what the people could eat at the time. You had ghettos, you had minority religions living in one part of town with guards and everything. So these people were in complete poverty, and he's just cooking for the kings. And it's another example of how the church state kind of controls people. This is one of the coolest dudes. Well, not really, but he's cool. So Bartolomeo Scappi, also known as Bartolomeo Platina, he was around in the 15th century. And he was an Italian Renaissance humanist writer, and he was also a gastronomist. So he was an Italian captain in command of mercenaries that would go out in the Middle Ages and fight pretty much multinational armies during the modern period. They most notably served European monarchs and popes during the Italian wars, and they fought minority religions like Muslims. So the Catholic Church was using people like him to try and dominate and become that dominant figure throughout the world. So he took some time after doing that, and he went to Paris, and that's where he met all these humanists. And humanists have like an open mind, and they promote things like polytheism, which is the idea of multi-deities, or the idea of not even believing in a deity. It's very similar to the beliefs that the Satanic Temple actually has. So after coming back from Paris, he went right to Rome, and he ended up as a writer for Pope Pius II, who was also a humanist. It's pretty interesting that the humanists at the time, there were people, this is a video of the food he was doing. It was like the humanists were the priests, they were like the popes, and there were all these different peoples of like, that you would be surprised of having these ideas. So he wrote a book while he was there. And he was also a chef to them too. And it was called On Honorable Pleasure and Health. It was a cookbook about Italian gastronomy. So what's important is that the Renaissance humanists promoted the idea that one can think for themselves. And this included the study at the time of things like paganism versus conditioning it under the church and state. So the pagans' resurgence was definitely prompted by the Renaissance humanism. It was an ancient part of Christianity, and it started to like come back because people were starting to research other forms of religion. There he is again. They'd all sit together at tables like this and eat with their hands. They didn't have forks and knives. It was like a Renaissance fair. So, as I said, humanism gives the polytheistic idea that one can choose its own deity. So, his book was basically the first real pushed and printed book. And when it went out, you know, the Pope and the Vatican, they really didn't have any idea what it was about. They trusted him. So he had just kept like releasing it and changing the editions, and he kept releasing it and changing the editions. And it happens to be one of the oldest recorded usage of cannabis cooking. So they used to smoke a lot of weed back then. So after being this troublemaker, his involvement came to an end with the Vatican all of a sudden. And that was after his cookbook had already been out, and they had considered what he was doing a protest towards the Catholic Church. And he was interrogated with nasty torture and massive accusations of trying to assassinate the Pope. And he and 20 others were assassinated on charges of heresy, which is pretty insane. And basically because he put out this cookbook and it allowed people to think for themselves. What's also interesting at the time was, in the 15th century, a book called Hammer of the Witches came out. And we can talk about that later. It was by a Catholic clergyman by Heinrich Kramer. And through the University of Cologne, he forged documents. And it started this thing called the Great Hunt. And that lasted all the way through the 1700s. And it's basically what happened here in Salem, where they hunted people down and accused them as witches. So it had different descriptions of things like in demonology and acts of witchcraft in it. And that's how you could identify a witch and find them and execute them. So it's pretty crazy. So being a chef back then and using something like a molecular gastronomy trick like fermentation could have gotten you scrutinized, tried, and executed on charges of alchemy, which is essentially magic. And right here, we have someone that was caught up in that time. That's Catherine de Shays, or Leviathan. Now here, there's a Leviathan chamber. And I don't know if you're familiar with the story. She was accused, and many others, of this thing called the Affair of the Poisons, which happened, you know, during King Louis the 24th court. And she was a fortune teller. She was a potion maker. She did underground abortions. And a couple of her alleged clients included the French members of the atrocity. So one of those people that was in her group was the king's mistress. And rumor has it that the king's mistress decided to like cut things off with the king, and it broke his heart. So he went after all the things that she was doing on her personal time. And that included this woman starting a theory, a conspiracy theory, and panic throughout Europe that she was creating things like poisons, and that it was causing this massive murdering of people. And not only that, but de Shays at the time was doing something called black masses. And it was pretty much like what you see and perform today. People using robes and black candles and naked bodies on an altar. And it was this like panic and all this fear of her being intertwined with the devil that ties to a magical underground network, much like people say there's an Illuminati, the conspiracy theories. So she and 36 people and 218 people were arrested, and most of them were executed. What's funny is a lot of these black masses that happened were conducted by a lot of Catholics as well. So there's like a little video you can watch, just kind of detailing her time. Like fast forward it a little bit. So like the idea of putting out a cookbook by a man who identifies as a Christian, but also promotes the idea of polytheism, which is the acceptance of multiple gods, did not go over well. What people do not realize is that Satanism has these ties to simple things like a cookbook written back in the day. And that includes a woman who tried to break boundaries. As you can see, she's in the court and she's been doing black masses, and they're accusing her of things, and I'm just going to fast forward it a little bit. We're going to stop here. So the next person we're going to talk about is Bartolomeo Scappi. So he lived in the 16th century of Rome. And much like Platina, he worked for the Vatican and he was a chef. And he was not Italian. He came from Lombardy, France. And he served under several cardinals until he made his way up into the Pope Pius's eyes. So some say that this Renaissance chef was the first PR-driven, publicized chef. And that means he had the biggest PR company behind him, and that was the Catholic Church and the Vatican. So he put out a cookbook, and it came out and burst onto the streets of Rome. And this book had thousands of recipes, most likely taken from cooks under him, other chefs, and it was passed down from generations. In the book, as you can see here, people are not eating with forks and knives. So, of course, now you can see somebody eating with a fork and knife. So this is one of the first recorded instances of some people eating with forks and knives. So apparently, he's the guy who pushed this whole idea. And the Vatican vetted thoroughly with this book, and they pushed all this out there to these people. And at the time, after getting this endorsement, he did things like promoting Parmesan cheese. And he also said some things that were a little scary. So at the time, Rome was very divided. You had a Jewish population there as well. There was a ghetto, a Jewish ghetto, and there was a big presence of them all living in this ghetto. And a lot of people don't know is that Jewish culture has a lot of influence on Italian cuisine. One of those things was foie gras, or the fattened duck liver, or geese. So he accused them of overfeeding them and overfattening them, and that we can do it better than them. So it created like a panic again of this culture of people who are living in a guarded ghetto, and they aren't allowed to leave or come and go, and they're stuck there. And it creates a bias and xenophobia towards people. So it's another example of how theocracy has placed the blame on minority religions. This has happened a lot in Satanism, especially during the Satanic Panic of the 80s and 90s. To further educate you on things like the Satanic Panic, I would read into Grey Faction of the Satanic Temple. Panic is also used as a control method by religions or governments. So the 17th century had a lot of chefs, but none of them had a really big influence like through culture as what ended up happening in the 18th century. So Nicholas Alpert, he's an interesting one. This is him right here. So he's a pioneer of things like canning, like preserving things. So he pretty much is that's how you get all those ideas. He was also involved in the execution of King Louis the 24th. So this is during the Enlightenment era. And what's interesting is that with King Louis is that he was that's him right there, King Louis. He was primarily focused on things like religious freedom and his foreign policy. While none doubted his intellectual ability to rule France, it was quite clear that he really couldn't do it. He had taken this job because it was passed down to him. He was grandfathered it. And he lacked a lot of the decisiveness and quick decision-making that a manager should have. But he had some really good ideas. And most notably, for signing into law, the Edict of Versailles. And that stopped witch hunts everywhere. It stopped religious persecution all over France at the time. And so, but it really didn't. It gave non-Catholics the right access denied to them. So the Catholic Church still ran the state pretty much. And even though this king claimed he was conservative, his ideas of enlightenment were pretty much liberal, opening up the world opening up a free world of religion, which includes minority religions like Satanism. So anybody could go out and study whatever religion they wanted because of this thing. Well, the people did not like that. A lot of the old conservatives did not like that, like this guy Alpert. So they went and they tried him personally, and they beheaded him. And you can kind of see it in this video, but you can't. And that's what we like to call the French Revolution. So it was a period of fundamental and political and sociological change in France. And it was considered the fundamental principles of Western liberal democracy. And the ideas of the Enlightenment played a major role in inspiring the French Revolution, which began in 1789 and emphasized the rights of common men as opposed to exclusive rights of the elites. Modern Satanism is a concept of modern Enlightenment values, believe it or not, which combines science, literature, and mythology imagery. And that brings us to this Enlightenment era philosophy, which are adapted into the language of things like the Satanic Temple. And they could have been the basis for culture wars, which have plagued human civilization for thousands of years. It's a little long. So, of course, they go to hang him, and it cuts out after that. I'll just fast forward it. There's him. There's King Louis. There's a guillotine. And he goes in the guillotine, and it does not show his head getting cut off at all. I know, completely lame. But this is a very important part of Satanic history, because without this happening, there would be no things like the Satanic Temple. I'll just fast forward it. That's all you really get to see anyways. He's got a great haircut. All these guys have great hair.
That guy?
Yes. I just ruined everything. So this is Jean Brillat-Savarin, and he had studied law, chemistry, and medicine in Dijon. He had written a book, which is probably one of the most important books in culinary arts, and that is called The Philosophy of Taste. This book was pretty much the first book that described on how to become a food critic. And this happened during a French literary movement in France. So he traveled all over during that time there were books like this one, which is very important, called Revolt of the Angels. You probably can't see it, but it's a very important book. I'd read it. And he traveled all over the United States, mostly in New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. And then he came back and he decided to write this book. And he would also refer to himself in the book as being this guy called the Professor, and it was really weird, but his writings about the pleasures of the table and having fun doing things like eating a poached fish or stuff like that. Or he also wrote this very important aphorism called, "Tell me what you eat, and I should tell you what you are," being the most famous among them. Like much 19th century writers, he can be long-winded, but came to appreciate attention to detail as he recounted each course of a dinner party and the demeanor of all those present. So he was basically like the first food critic. And this is a picture of the experience of cooking and eating almost 200 years ago. Baudelaire, at the time, who's famous for writing this book, I don't know if you guys can see it, Flowers of Evil. This is a very old copy. This is the 1949 copy. So, Flowers of Evil was first published in 1857. It's an analogy of fresh hedonistic poetry, and it contains a very famous poem, The Linodies of Satan, which passage starts reading, I can pull it up, "Glory and praise you, O Satan," and has the lines, "Under the tree of knowledge, when over your brow its branches will grow and spread like a new temple." Now, he was highly influenced by writers like William Blake and Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost. So he ended up influencing people like Anatole France, who wrote Revolt of the Angels. Linodies of Satan is also a performance piece by the 20th century performance artist Damandia Gallas. It was seen as an insult to public decency at the time, and it was so controversial. Let's stop here. It was so controversial that Baudelaire and his publisher were prosecuted by the Second French Empire. 6 of his poems were banned from being published until this book came out in 1949. It pretty much absconded all aspects of the Catholic religion of its time, and it showed itself to be a reflection of his hatred of Catholics and Christianity. It's what we like to call reactive Satanism, which is intended for shock value, a person who uses the devil's name to provide controversy. An example of reactive Satanism are serial killer Richie Ramirez or rocker King Diamond. Now, Jean Savary, his reputation was revitalized among modern gastronomers in parts of the world, and by his aphorism, "Tell me what you eat and I'll tell you what you are." And you're asking what this has to do with Satanism at this point. Well, it's, of course, he's caught up in the literary movement, and without this literary movement, you would not have the idea of writing all these books and the idea of free thinking that you get today. Now, he didn't have to use the word Satan to bring about controversy. He was giving people the right to think freely on their own without the stipulation of using and quoting the church at the time. And that makes me, in my eyes, he was a rebel and he was a risk taker who influenced a new realm of thinking. And I call that culinary arts. One of his other quotes, which is also interesting, and this ties into Satanism, "Man is an omnivorous animal. He possesses incisive teeth for dividing fruit, molar teeth for crushing grain, and canine teeth for tearing flesh. It has been remarked that the closer man approaches to the primitive state, the stronger and more conspicuous are his canine teeth." And this is a reflection of 20th century Satanist Anton LaVey's quotes. "Satan represents man as just another animal, sometimes better, often worse than those who walk on all fours." Sorry, Jack. Who, because of his divine spiritual and intellectual development, has become the most vicious animal of them all. Now, that is very wrong in many ways, because this kind of reflects social Darwinism. And social Darwinism is a concept created by Charles Darwin, but based on Charles Darwin's ideas of the humans come from the monkey, and evolution had started that way. And it was that his proposition that all species of life descended from common ancestors, and that is now widely accepted and a fundamental concept in science. And Darwinism, as we said, really pissed off the Catholic Church because they were like, hey man, no, God created the earth. So a deity made this. In a lot of religions, that's how people think. So social Darwinism refers to the various theories that emerged in Western Europe and North America through the late 1900s that applied biological concepts of natural selection and survival to the fittest sociology. It also says that the strong see their wealth and power increase, while the weak see their wealth and power decrease. Many of these people that like to really encompass the ideas are gross, and they're a lot of national and radical groups and people that support eugenics and racism. So social Darwinism is a no-no. It also helped push the narrative that minority religions were bad, especially Judaism. This includes books such as The Elders of Zion. And this was a witch hunting book that came out in 1905, and it came out in Russia, and it basically said that it fabricated anti-Semitic text saying that there was a Jewish plan for global domination. Like there was basically, as we said, a panic going on. And one of the people that believed in this was Henry Ford at the time, of Ford cars. So whenever you see a Ford car driving by, think about that. It's pretty crazy. He actually wrote an essay about it in 1918. And another person that we know that was really behind that book was Adolf Hitler. And that brought upon the genocide of the Jewish population till 1945. So it's pretty crazy. But at this point, while Jean is alive, chefs had worked in castles. They worked for kings. They worked for the monarchy. They had worked, they did not work in restaurants. They were working for, the Vatican or the church-ran states. So this is kind of where it kind of eases in. So we're going to stop this right here. So to me, being a chef in those times could have caused you to be executed pretty much, as we know. What was also happening at the time was that America was going through a transition where they had just freed slaves. And the idea was that, from a Christian point of view, is that they would come to America and try and convert these slaves to Christianity before they got their freedom. And that's basically how Southern Baptism started. And a lot of these people ended up becoming the first cooks and the first chefs of the world. And that's how they had incorporated a lot of dishes from their countries that involved like peppers and like things like collard greens, which ended up, becoming a part of very Southern cuisine. So I'm just saying that like back in those days, you got your freedom, but you worked 24 hours a day. And you made no money. So this idea of enslaving people to work in restaurants was kind of conceptualized and ended up bleeding itself into modern kitchen management in the United States. So next we're going to talk about Auguste Escoffier. So Escoffier, he was a French chef, and he designed this thing called the brigade system. He is recognized as one of the humans that updated traditional French cooking methods. He was a humanist. And he is also the chef responsible for creating the sauces, which are bechamel, espagnole, tomato, velouté, hollandaise. He is also known for creating, as we see here, the brigade system. So basically, he went to war. He was in the French army. He had worked in kitchens before this. He comes back, and he decides he's going to take over a restaurant. And what he notices is that, as a humanist, the chef is swearing, he's screaming, just like you see on TV, and he's smoking, and he's drinking, and everybody is like that. And he's like, there is no order in the kitchen. So he set up this system where it starts with the head chef, and then it goes down to the chef de cuisine, and then you have over here, the expediters, and then you have each person working their stations, and the people working underneath them, like the commis chef. And this is really what he wanted to do, is help people. He did not want this abusive kind of management system. He wanted to use humanism to bring upon professionalism. Unfortunately, his vision did not go very far, let's just say that. And I don't know what ended up happening, but he was a genius cook. He's responsible for a lot of the things that we have today. But this method, this original method, was a way to get cooks to have, here he is again, a work-life balance. And he did this because he was very influenced in humanism. Stop here. And then this guy. So Escaffier's vision was basically, I want to have a kitchen. I want everybody to be professional. I want people to be respectful of each other. And I want the bosses to be able to be respectful of people, because I want them to be allowed to have free thinking, which are the same Enlightenment values that people like humanists were trying to push to people. And that included the idea of polytheism and worshiping multiple deities or anything, nothing if you wanted. So then this guy came along, Frederick Winslow Taylor. So he was a mechanical engineer. He was super smart. He ended up creating the ideas of efficiency in industrial manufacturing. And he wrote a book called The Principles of Scientific Management, which came out in 1911, a little bit after Escoffier had implemented his brigade system. So this book is quoted as being one of the most important management books, apparently, of the 20th century. And what's interesting is his take on how humans should be treated. And since he supposedly wrote the system for management, his system was adapted into restaurants. The idea that somebody who had learning disabilities or somebody that wasn't as smart as somebody else could end up doing the odd jobs, and they weren't allowed to do anything else but. And that's what he was pretty much pushing. He wanted the ideas to be all in the manager's hands. So if you went to your boss and you came up with an idea, your boss would take advantage of that. That's what he was saying back then. So he pushed this whole idea of a toxic workplace environment into something like the brigade system. And I believe it's around this time that you had all these great chefs coming about, and that's when things just started to revert back to bullying and harassment and screaming and treating people like it was not intended to be. So transferring the ideas of the worker to the management, again, where the managers take credit for everything. And I'm sure we've all been there before. So that meant that there were two types of workers. There were the yes men or the no men, or those who say pretty much yes. The idea that the workers that were the not very intellectual, aka the freed slaves or the immigrants and those coming from minority religions were indeed, according to him, stupid. He has this quote which says, "One of the first requirements for a man who is fit to handle a pig iron," we'll stop here, "handle a pig iron as regular occupation is that he shall be so stupid and so phlegmatic that he more nearly resembles his mental makeup, the ox, than any other type. The guy that is more mentally alert and intelligent for this very reason would be unsuited for what that guy could do." So this pushes the narrative that it pushes basically toxic workplace environments and anti-intellectualism and giving people a chance. So you've seen Hell's Kitchen, and people have been romanticized and things like that movie Burnt with Bradley Cooper, or this idea that a chef is a chain-smoking, screaming, just very troubled individual. That is how we have believed, because of these forms of management, that that's what goes on in every kitchen. And because of that, that's what a lot of these people have ended up doing. So it completely takes the ideas of a humanist, like a Scappi, and just throws them out the door. And it's now that we're all finally realizing that if you treat people like garbage, nobody's going to want to work for you. So how does this tie into Satanism? Because rejecting the formula of compassionate management to a proven non-scientific way of thinking, again, creates an imbalanced work environment for many. In some places, being a Satanist means that you're an outcast and tempered to think as such. So you're working at a place and everyone says you're the weirdo, and that's where you're staying. You're not evolving after that. This old world way of thinking then embraces the Satanist into their kitchen or workplace and promising them a life in hopes of their conformity, meaning they're just going to forget about everything that they believe in and throw it out the door. And it gives them the idea that nobody but this unprofessional place that they're working at will hire them. And it's not just Satanists, it's the outcasts of society, the people who are called different, the people who are called stupid by their superiors, and never advance because of their beliefs, their sexuality, their sexual orientation, or color of skin. It was the Enlightenment values that have kept the industry not like this, pretty much. And the idea that if we just treat people with respect, that we'll get respect. That's how Satanists, I feel, can relate to the restaurant industry in many ways. We also are pretty much the rebels of society, which a lot of people, like every chef, is. So you're having a job that the guy who puts on a suit and tie does not have. You have more in common with somebody who's a musician than you do with somebody who has a 9-to-5 job. And that is all because of American anti-intellectualism. It is not science-based. It is pseudoscience. And it enforces religious-based stereotypes that allow different power imbalances to happen. There are many chefs, including in our area, New England, that believe in change. And a couple of them, Jamie Bissonette, Rachel Miller, who's in Lynn, and Matt Jennings. So to make matters worse, there are plenty of restaurants which are also supported by organized religion. And of course, let's talk about the first one, In-N-Out Burger. I don't know if you guys have been to an In-N-Out Burger. It is delicious, I have to admit. But this food chain, it started in 1948 by Harry and Esther Snyder. The company is known for putting Bible verses on their packaging. So the founder's granddaughter and current owner is Lindsay Snyder. She is a born-again Christian. This is just a part of a movie. She's a born-again Christian, and she has said that Jesus has saved her from a dark lifestyle. And even though their burger is delicious, what people should know is that company gives like $250,000 to the California Republican Party every year. And another one of these companies is Wegmans, believe it or not. So Wegmans, I know, right? I love Wegmans.
I didn't hear that part.
You can just close your...
Just kidding.
So Wegmans started in Rochester, New York in 1916. John Walter Wegman founded the store, and the founder's son, pause this. The founder's son, the late Bob Wegman, he ended up putting his mission on the company from something he learned in Catholic elementary school. Not only that, he said that the most important thing in life is getting to heaven. So he wanted to promote that to all his workers. And he was not only a supporter and donated to Catholic schools and Catholic teachings, but also faith-based organizations. That includes Good News Clubs, which happen in a lot of schools all over the country. And what that is basically an organization, a Christian church, including a right-wing Christian church, can go into your elementary school that your kids go to school at, rent out a room afterwards, and call this basically an after-school session. The Satanic Temple has its own version. It's called After School Satan. If you want to read a really good book, it's by a woman named Catherine Stewart. She wrote a book titled Good News Clubs. The next one, this guy's a character. So H-E-B Grocery Store is a store based out of San Antonio, Texas. It was founded in 1905 by Florence Butt. She died shortly after, but her son Howard ended up taking over the family business. And in the 1950s, he became very, very, very close with Billy Graham, a very famous right-winged Christian personality. So here's a commercial from H-E-B Grocery Stores. H-E-B, Howard was the person who also is known for his works in Good News Clubs and trying to convert children to Christianity and Christian teaching that happens in rented spaces in public schools. He was also a proponent of creating faith-based Christian spiritual programs for businesses. Stop this. He had closed all his stores on Sunday just so he could study to become a clergyman. Like every single Sunday. And another person that would surprise you is John Willard Marriott. He's the guy who founded the Marriott Corporation. He was a practicing Mormon, and when he was 19, he came to New England, and he went around knocking on doors and handing out books from the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints. And afterwards, he made it his mission, and he took his own money to put a Bible in every single nightstand when you go into a hotel. So that's the reason why. That's insane. You could spend your money on something else. Then we have this guy. So we have Chick-fil-A, which was founded by Dwarf Gill in 1946, a year after World War II ended. So he ended up serving fried chicken sandwiches, and automatically, since this guy was a fundamental Christian, he pretty much decided every Sunday we are going to close our store. So that includes Thanksgiving and Christmas Day to honor the Western Christian season of Lent. The company's varying stance, often in opposition to same-sex marriage, has been a subject of public controversy, as we can see here. The company has kind of started to lose its stance on the issue because they have gotten scrutinized by the public, and they've been boycotted by Boston, Massachusetts, believe it or not. Mayor Menino came out and said, you cannot come and open a restaurant in my city. Do it elsewhere, because I purposefully stood on the grounds of City Hall and welcomed gay people in the day that same-sex marriages were approved. And that's true. So not only is it closed on Sundays, but they have a huge Chick-fil-A inside this place right here. This is the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, which happens to be in Atlanta, Georgia. Closed every single Sunday. Do people know what goes on in football stadiums on Sundays? Football games. So they're losing billions of dollars just keeping a Chick-fil-A in there to prove a point, that we are closed on Sundays. So it's absolutely insane. You can fast forward this for a minute. Then there's this guy. And what's interesting about the stadium is that this guy, his name is Kanye West. He is a Trump supporter. He's a right-wing Republican. And he is currently at that stadium recording and using that stadium for his new record. It's absolutely insane. There's him with Donald Trump. He loves Donald Trump. So people are wondering, oh, it's so cool that this guy is doing this at the stadium, but people don't realize that the stadium has deep ties to right wing, and it's disgusting. There's like even so much that he has decided to include this into his new stage show where he's basically Jesus floating up into the clouds. It's insane. But we don't want to look at him anymore. We'll look at him. So again, Satanists can relate to the effects of religious theocracy as well as the restaurant industry can as well. The effects that religious theocracy has given on gastronomy over the years has stirred the process of the right management skills and has promoted things like anti-intellectualism. And people that have promoted things like Enlightenment values and humanism have really brought that together. And that's how it pretty much affects Satanism. And thanks you guys for coming. This is my first time talking. So thanks for bearing with me. And hopefully I made some sense. I'm going to open the room up to you guys if you want to ask any questions.
Can you tell us about your book?
Yeah, my cookbook coming out. It's called Devil's Food, and it's going to be out October 10th. And there's about 40 recipes in there. And Courtney Brooke, Light Witch, she did all the photography for it, and it's going to be absolutely amazing. And it's going to be here at the Satanic Temple.
Is there a devil's food cake recipe in the book?
Absolutely not. I hate devil's food cake.
What about, can you tell us what's on your mind for the Devil's Dinners coming up?
For the Devil's Dinners coming up, I am going to have, I think one night is going to be a vegetarian night, and then the other night is going to be a pescatarian night. And there's going to be a ritual involved with Zandora and I, and that involves a destruction ritual where I have people writing a name down on a piece of paper, and I usually take that piece of paper and I light it on fire. And this happens to be a Bible, so there we go. Hail Satan, guys.